Floor 13 by S.M. Andrews. Forward. Having read my first two works in this small project, you'll notice a distinct shift in style and genre in this story. This was actually not meant to be published in a lit mag, and is probably the only one I've written purely for the fun of it. That isn't to say I didn't enjoy writing the others, but this one was unique in that I had no other motive save my own desire to put pen to paper for this. Floor 13 is a drastic shift from the horror or fantasy genre, and employs a more noir feel. Well, I've rambled enough in this already, so please enjoy Floor 13. Floor 13. The elevator doors slid open, the dim overhead light spilling into the otherwise pitch-black room. The feeling of cool dampness that only comes from unfinished concrete rooms flowed into the elevator car. No lights glowed on the panel for our floor selection. In fact, the number for the floor this was supposed to be wasn't even an option. A small square box with an LED that had briefly glowed green when Ken had waved an ID card in front of it now glowed red. Ken stepped from the white-walled, red-carpeted elevator into the small square of light that pooled in front of it. His hands in the pockets of his black leather jacket, his sneakers made almost no sound on the bare gray concrete as he stopped at the edge of the light. That light began to narrow as the doors slid closed behind him until there was only a tiny, thin sliver. Then that too shrank as the elevator car was called to another floor. He was now immersed in darkness. Despite the cool, a bead of sweat ran down the back of his neck. Suddenly he was engulfed in bright, searing light. He threw up his left hand to shield his eyes while his right drew out the snub-nosed .38 from his pocket. "There'll be no need for that," a voice told him from somewhere within the conflagration that had caused spots to dance in his vision. The voice was utterly devoid of emotion or even accent. It was as nondescript as a human man's voice could get. Slowly Ken lowered his hand as his eyes adjusted, though now all he could see was the silhouette of a half-dozen people sitting around a semicircular table. The light was coming from behind them and far too bright to look directly at. Instead, he chose to focus on a spot just a few feet in front of them on the floor. None of the people at the table made a move towards Ken, or even fidgeted in their seat as most people do when a gun is suddenly introduced into a situation. Instead, they remained utterly motionless. It unnerved Ken. It was like looking at a department store mannequin. Ken put the gun back in his pocket, but left his hand on it. He didn't get this far in life being stupid or careless, though now he felt as though he may have made that first, all-important, last mistake. "That's a good lad. Please state your name," the voice called again. "Ken Jaspers. I got a message said to use this." He held up a small black ID card with his name embossed on it in silver script. "At exactly 11 p.m. today if I wanted to make some money. Well, here I am. What's this about?" He tried the tough guy act, though to his ears it sounded as false as it felt just then. "And who gave you that particular ID?" A different voice this time, female, and just as ordinary as the man's had been, though this sounded like it came from the left side of the table as Ken looked at it. "Dunno," he admitted. "A guy in a trench coat with a fedora pulled low. Never saw his face. It was like something out of an old noir detective movie." Cliché as hell, too, Ken thought, but didn't say. He also didn't mention how close their errand boy had come to taking a bullet to the chest. "Did this man give you a word to say when you got here?" a third voice asked, slightly deeper than the first man's and coming from the right side of the table. "Yeah, he said to say floor 13 and buy in."
"Excellent, Mr. Jaspers,"
a fourth voice, a little nasally and coming from the center figure at the table.
"You have been selected because you fulfill certain requirements of our organization. Our records indicate that you are the hired man of one—"
There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling.
"Jimmy Valentino, also known as Jimmy the Blade. Is this correct?"
"Yeah," Ken replied, suspicious. "See, I don't do setups and I don't snitch nothing."
"Really, Mr. Jaspers, if we were law enforcement, do you honestly think we'd go to all this trouble just to get you to turn on your employer? It's a bit convoluted, don't you think?"
The voice sounded as though they were speaking to a rather slow child. "Guess that makes sense," Ken said. "Of course it does," said the female voice.
"Our records indicate that you are referred to as Jimmy's cleanup man. Is this correct?"
the nasally voice asked. Ken kept his mouth shut. He'd seen the cops pull some messed up stuff in his life and wouldn't put it past them to do something this elaborate.
Mr. Jaspers, again, we assure you that we are not the police. In fact, what we have invited you here for is very decidedly outside the bounds of lawful conduct.
The man let out a long-suffering sigh.
Mr. Jaspers, what we are offering is an opportunity to apply your skills for a chance to make a great deal of money. All you need to do is kill someone.
Ken froze. Something was very wrong here, and he knew it. Sure, he'd cleaned up problems for Jimmy from time to time. These people were right about that. Got paid pretty well for it if he was honest with himself. Well enough he hadn't had to work an honest job in years. Another trickle of sweat joined the first down his back. He said nothing.
I realize, said Knavesley's voice again, this may seem a bit unusual. Perhaps I should allow one of my colleagues to explain before you relieve yourself on the floor.
The last line was delivered with an obvious distaste. Our organization runs a game, the female voice began, albeit a very dangerous and very lucrative one. Brief motion among them disturbed the light, but who moved or how, Ken couldn't say. First, did you bring your buy-in? Ken fumbled inside his jacket for a manila envelope thick with $100 bills in stacks. He held it up in front of his face, hoping to block the glare just long enough to get a view of the people he was talking to. 50 grand, just like I was told, he said. The female voice sounded disappointed. The minimum entry fee. Well, no matter. You see, this game involves only 2 players at a time. The hunter and the prey. That had been more than 24 hours ago. Now Ken sat in the front seat of his rented SUV and stared down on a sidewalk. He was parked on the right side of a narrow 2-lane street. To his left, a small convenience store sat on one side of a side street, a cemetery to the other. To his right, a long series of townhomes, all the same, save perhaps a different coat of paint or different ugly lawn decoration. It had taken Ken nearly all of the day following his meeting with Floor 13 to find his target. His window was only 48 hours. Even with his exceptional reach throughout the criminal underworld, his prey was exceptionally elusive. Eventually, though, with the right palms greased and a few others broken, he had found him. His instructions were simple. He'd been told he could employ any form of killing he liked, but it could only be done by his hand, one-on-one. If the target died as a result of fleeing or indirect incident, the game was forfeited. All he needed to do was off the guy, grab his keycard, and get away. He was assured that if there were police involvement, that they had the reach to make it go away. He'd also been told that the card he was looking for would be very much like his own, only with the target's name on it. Seemed like an awful lot of effort, but the payout they'd mentioned was more than worth it. It made his 50 grand, all he'd had to hand, look like chump change. Ken glanced at his watch. It was 1:15. No traffic passed by in either direction. The street looked nearly deserted save for the parked cars along the shoulder. The one a couple of spots ahead was a rust bucket Toyota. The one directly behind, an old white service van with the decals painted over in off-white spray paint. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel of his rented Chevy. Beige and boring, it suited his taste for this job perfectly, as nondescript as cars got, and there were thousands of them on the road. Add the fake ID, payment in cash, then have a lackey drop it off, and it was essentially impossible to trace it back to him. There was movement in his passenger side mirror, and Ken tensed. His right hand settled slowly on the revolver on the passenger seat. Best weapon to use for this sort of thing. The semi-automatic would eject shell casings, and those could be traced. The revolver dropped nothing, and could easily be disposed of later. A man in his mid-30s, average height and build, sandy blonde hair, glasses. His face matched the photograph Ken had perfectly. The man's light jacket was unzipped, and Ken didn't see any obvious signs of a gun. I guess when you're desperate you'll do anything for money, he thought. He glanced around. Still didn't see anyone else on the street. Though how he came up with the cash to enter the game is still a mystery to me. In the end, it didn't matter. A job was a job. Ken replayed what he knew of the guy in his head. Wife and son dead in a drive-by a couple of years ago. He'd taken a bullet to the chest, but lived. While he was in the hospital, he'd lost his home to foreclosure. Wife's life insurance barely covered burying her and the kid. The guy hadn't been employed since. But these are some pretty decent houses for a guy with no money and no job, Ken mumbled to himself. His target began to walk by his car, so Ken opened the texting app on his phone and pretended to send a message. The guy never even looked sideways. Ken tucked the phone back into his pocket and slowly opened the door. The guy, Walker, Ken reminded himself, was about 50 feet away and didn't seem to have heard the door open. To be safe, Ken didn't close the door but let it settle back. The dome light stayed on, but since he didn't plan to be gone long, he wasn't worried about a dead battery. Easing up behind a tree, he leaned against it and pulled out his phone again. He turned on the front-facing camera and held it like he was texting again, except the camera was facing down the sidewalk and he was watching Walker's back as he continued along. He hadn't slowed or seemed to notice anything even as he sidestepped a spot in the sidewalk that had heaved up from a large tree root. A few weeds grew in the crack. Ken stepped out from behind the tree, switched the camera back to the outward-facing setting, and followed, face down and engrossed in the image it gave him. His soft sneakers made almost no noise on the concrete sidewalk. He didn't raise the phone high enough to see all of Walker's back. He didn't need to. All he needed to see was his feet. They would give away anything he needed to know, and keep it from being obvious what Ken was doing. Angled up too high, it would be obvious he was watching Walker. Zoomed in like he was, Ken saw the moment Walker's feet turned right to head up a cracked walk towards the front door of a dark blue townhouse, a near twin to the ones on either side. White front door near the right corner of the house, a space barely wide enough to walk between the two houses just beside it. 2 white windows to the left taking up the available space on the wall, shades down and closed. 2 windows spaced equidistant on the second floor, no decorations in the yard save a low shrub under the first floor windows. The grass looked like it needed mowing. Walker stopped at the door and pulled a set of keys from his right front pocket. Ken continued, his pace not changing, his phone still pointed straight ahead. He watched Walker from the corner of his eye. Come on, he thought as he neared the point where he would have to walk past Walker's front door. Open your damn door already. Finally, Ken saw the front door crack open, and he made his move. Jamming his phone in his pocket, he ran for the door. In no more than a couple of seconds, he was shouldering it open just as it was closing. He'd drawn his revolver, a Smith & Wesson .44 Magnum that always made him feel like Dirty Harry when he held it. He'd left the .38 at home. The .44 offered more stopping power. One shot was essentially a guaranteed kill. The door slammed open against the wall and stuck, the knob jamming a hole in the drywall behind it, and Ken stumbled through. He'd expected Walker to still be just on the other side, that it would smash him in the back and send him sprawling. There was no sign of him. Straight ahead of him was a narrow hallway that ended in an open archway into the kitchen. He could see a sliding glass door that looked out into the backyard, also in need of mowing, but it was closed. The end of a dark brown table and chair were just visible beyond the archway. White painted walls down each side were broken up by another archway into a living room on his left and a set of stairs on his right. Thinking quickly, Ken called out, "Police! Show yourself!" He'd used this particular ruse more than once with stunningly effective results. Most people have nothing to fear from the police and generally follow their instructions without thought. This time there was no response. He strained his ears, listening for any sound, but heard nothing. Throwing himself against the left-hand wall, he peered into the small living room on his left. He saw a brown leather couch and matching recliner, a decent-sized flat-screen TV, and the continuation of the same battered hardwood floor as the hallway, but no people. He eased past the empty room towards the kitchen, planning to clear the small downstairs before heading up. If Walker bolted down the stairs to the open front door, Ken would have a perfect shooting lane. He held the revolver in both hands, held out at chest level. He tested each step before he made it, looking for creaking floorboards or anything else that might give him away. As he reached the archway, a foot lashed out and smashed his hands against the corner of the doorway. He could feel the bones in his left forearm give way with a crack. It sounded like someone snapping a dry stick over their knee. The pain made him want to vomit, but he'd felt it before and held his focus. Though his left hand was now essentially useless, he managed to maintain his grip on his gun with his right. He turned the gun that way, and though he knew that recoil was likely to blow the gun out of his hand, he prepared to fire the beast of a revolver anyway. He never got the chance. A hand darted out, snatched the barrel, and twisted before Ken could pull the trigger. Since he had only one hand on the gun, he couldn't keep a solid grip. It fell to the floor with a clunk on the linoleum. Ken glanced up in shock to see Walker's face, placid, almost bored. In a flash, Walker's hand struck out, catching Ken in the throat with a fist. The sound of the gun striking the floor and the fist striking his throat were almost simultaneous. Ken choked and gurgled, trying to catch his breath. His hands instinctively reached up to his now crushed larynx. With calm, effortless motion, Walker stepped behind Ken and looped a garrote around his neck. He pulled back, and Ken could feel his weight lifting off his feet. His eyes bulged, and he dug at the thin wire with his limp left hand, while reaching back to paw at Walker with his right. Walker placed his knee in Ken's back and leaned away, keeping his face out of reach. In moments, Ken's vision was grayish at the edges. Then his world consisted of a long, black tunnel focused on the crappy brown refrigerator in front of him. A picture on its side of a pretty blonde woman and a young boy in a baseball cap held there with an alphabet magnet. A W, or maybe an upside-down M. His last thought before even that faded was, Dirty Harry wouldn't have gone down this easy. Then he thought no more. The elevator doors slid open, light once again spilling in a small square into the bare gray room. A tall silhouette stood in the light as it diminished with the closing of the doors. The bright lights came up again, just as blinding, and the nasally voice began to speak.
Well done, Mr. Walker, he trailed off.
No one was standing in the light. A gun cocked behind his head. 5 sets of eyes turned sharply towards the sound. The 6th had held perfectly still, a .44 Magnum pressed against his skull. Nasally voice swallowed around the collar and tie of his $1,000 suit, steel gray hair slightly parted by the gun barrel. No one moved. Nasally voice cleared his throat.
Am I to assume this is your way of saying you'd like to cash out, Mr. Walker?
His voice held a tremor. Not at all. A calm voice, though hard as stone.
Well, you've already a substantial pot awaiting you. Several $1 million, as a matter of fact. I'm sure that money would do you well for a long, happy life.
Nasaly's voice cut off as the gun pushed his head a little further forward. The motion pushed back the sleeve of Walker's coat, his green beret tattoo slightly visible on his forearm. I think you misunderstand me. There will be 6 more wagers placed into that pot, Walker said. 1 for each of you. Maximum buy-in.
That's billions of dollars,
a man in the far left end spluttered. Why would we do that? The female voice asked. Walker didn't even turn his head. Because I'm switching my role as the rules allow. I'm becoming the hunter, and you 6 are my new prey. He pulled the gun back and held it steady at waist level, still pointed at the back of Nasally Voice's head. Did you think I didn't know it was you 6 that put the hit on my family? Did you think I didn't know you did it to drive me into your little game? Nasally Voice was shaking like a leaf in a storm. Unable to control himself, the sharp smell of urine filled the air.
But I...
Save it, Walker cut him off. Press the buttons. 6 small panels, one in front of each member of Floor 13, were glowing. Almost as one, all of them shaking, they input the key that would dump the entirety of their fortunes into the pot. A 7th panel glowed in the center, revealing the final tally. $3,287,000,000. Now, Walker said, putting the gun down to his side, you all have 2 hours head start. Put your IDs for this floor on the table and leave. Go. All 6 members of Floor 13 scrambled, throwing themselves over the table, around overturned chairs in their mad dash for the elevator. As soon as the doors closed for the final time, Walker calmly leaned over and pressed the payout button. A message in green said, "Please wait," as a progress bar grew from the left-hand side of the screen. While he waited, he gathered up the ID cards. Each one contained not just their sole ability to enter Floor 13, but also their personal information, such as the addresses of each of their properties. All it would take was a simple RFID reader and the appropriate software. Software Floor 13 had conveniently supplied him when they had pulled him in. In a matter of seconds, the entirety of their fortunes were transferred into an untraceable account well out of their reach. Walker pointed the weapon at the computer tower under the table and fired one shot. With a popping crackle, the screens all went dead. He walked around to the lights, turned off all but one, shining directly at the center of the table, recently vacated by the now defunct Floor 13. Walker pulled a photo of a pretty blonde woman and a young boy in a baseball cap from inside his jacket pocket, kissed it, and placed it on the table directly in the beam of light. Then he, too, headed for the elevator. The end.